Walk into any grocery store in America, and you're surrounded. Aisles upon aisles of brightly colored packages, each one promising convenience, flavor, and satisfaction. Pick up a box of cereal, a frozen dinner, a bottle of soda. Look at the ingredients list. Can you pronounce half of those words? Do you even know what they are? Most people don't, and that's exactly how the food industry wants it. But here's what they don't want you to know. There's a term that describes most of what fills those shelves. A term that emerged from decades of concern, was dismissed by powerful corporations, and then suddenly became impossible to ignore. That term is ultra-processed food, and the story of how it got its name reveals a battle that has been raging since the 1980s. A battle for control over what ends up on your plate and in your body. Before we dive deeper into this hidden history, I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? I love knowing how far these stories reach and connecting with people from all over. Drop your location in the comments below. Now, most people think ultra-processed foods are just a modern marketing term, something health gurus invented to sell books or supplements. But the truth is far more complex and far more disturbing. The concept didn't come from a laboratory or a corporate boardroom. It came from researchers who noticed something terrifying. As countries modernized their food systems, chronic diseases exploded. Heart disease, diabetes, cancer, obesity. All of them following the same pattern, appearing wherever Western food culture took hold. To understand where ultra-processed foods really came from, you have to go back to World War II. That's when everything changed. The military needed food that could survive months in storage, withstand extreme temperatures, and provide maximum calories to soldiers fighting across continents. So food scientists got creative. They developed powdered cheeses, dehydrated potatoes, canned meats that lasted years, chocolate bars that wouldn't melt in the desert heat. They added preservatives, flavorings, vitamins. They wrapped everything in revolutionary new packaging materials designed to survive beach landings and jungle humidity. After the war ended, all that innovation didn't disappear. It found a new home. The civilian food industry saw an opportunity. Why let all this technology go to waste? Companies like Kraft, General Mills, and Coca-Cola transformed wartime rations into peacetime convenience. TV dinners arrived in the 50s. Instant everything flooded supermarkets in the 60s. By the 70s, American kitchens looked nothing like they had a generation before. But something else happened in the 70s that would change everything. Government farm subsidies created a massive surplus of corn and soybeans. Fields across the Midwest produced more grain than anyone knew what to do with. So food scientists found a solution. They broke down these crops into their component parts and created new ingredients that had never existed before. High fructose corn syrup, modified starches, protein isolates, hydrogenated oils. These weren't foods. They were industrial materials derived from food, chemical building blocks. They could be reassembled into products engineered for maximum profit and shelf life. The 1980s became the golden age of food processing. Investors demanded higher returns from food manufacturers, so companies developed thousands of new products. Sugary cereals marketed to children, soft drinks in every flavor imaginable, snack foods engineered to be irresistible. Fast food chains exploded across the country. Convenience became king. Why cook when you could microwave? Why prepare when you could unwrap? The tobacco companies Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds even diversified into food, bringing their expertise in creating addictive products to the grocery aisle. And here's where the term ultra-processed actually first appeared. Not in some scientific journal or government report, but in the concerned voices of nutritionists and health advocates in the 1980s who saw what was happening and tried to warn people. They looked at these highly processed convenience foods and snacks, saw how energy-dense they were, how poor in real nutrients, how loaded with synthetic additives like emulsifiers, artificial colors, sweeteners, and flavor enhancers. They knew something was wrong, but when they spoke up, something interesting happened. The food industry and their powerful allies fought back hard. These concerned health professionals were labeled food faddists, pseudoscientists, alarmists. Their warnings were dismissed as the paranoid rantings of people stuck in the past, afraid of progress. The industry spent millions making sure their message drowned out any criticism. After all, there was too much money at stake. Because by the 1980s, the Western diet had become a gold mine. The more you process any food, the more profitable it becomes. A potato is cheap. But turn it into chips, add 17 ingredients, package it in foil, and suddenly you can charge 5 times as much. A tomato costs pennies. But break it down, add sugar and modified cornstarch, turn it into ketchup, and you've created a product with a massive profit margin and a 2-year shelf life. The entire food system had been rebuilt around one principle: maximum processing equals maximum profit. Then came the turning point. In 2009, a Brazilian epidemiologist named Carlos Monteiro published a paper that changed everything. Monteiro had been studying an odd paradox in Brazil. As people bought less sugar and cooking oils, rates of obesity and diabetes kept climbing. It made no sense. Until he looked closer at what people were actually eating. They weren't buying raw sugar, but they were consuming massive amounts of it through processed products. The sugar was hidden in sodas, packaged snacks, instant meals. The fats weren't coming from bottles of oil, but from industrial formulations loaded into convenience foods. Monteiro realized something profound. The problem wasn't any single nutrient. It wasn't about fat versus carbs, or natural versus artificial. The problem was the degree of processing itself. So he created a classification system called NOVA, grouping foods into 4 categories based on how much industrial processing they'd undergone. The 4th category, the most processed, he called ultra-processed foods, and he defined them clearly. These were industrial formulations made mostly from substances extracted from foods or synthesized from food components. They contained ingredients you'd never find in a home kitchen: hydrogenated oils, high fructose corn syrup, modified starches, hydrolyzed proteins, and they were loaded with additives designed to make the final product hyperpalatable: colors, flavors, emulsifiers, sweeteners, thickeners, all the chemicals that made processed food irresistible. Monteiro's paper didn't just define ultra-processed foods. It provided evidence linking them to disease. His research showed that as consumption of these foods increased, so did rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. The correlation was undeniable. And suddenly, all those dismissed warnings from the 80s didn't seem so crazy anymore. But defining ultra-processed foods also revealed how deeply they'd infiltrated the food supply. According to NOVA, most bread is ultra-processed. So is flavored yogurt, plant-based meat substitutes, even some infant formula. The category includes obvious junk like soda and chips, but also products marketed as healthy. Breakfast cereals fortified with vitamins, protein bars, diet foods, low-fat versions of everything, products that promised health while delivering the opposite. The food industry didn't like this, not one bit, because Monteiro's classification threatened billions in profits. So they pushed back. Critics argued the definition was too broad, too imprecise. They said it was unscientific to condemn foods based on processing rather than nutrients. Some researchers, funded by companies like Nestle, published papers questioning whether processing itself was really the problem. They suggested it was just about the fat, sugar, and salt. Remove those, they said, and ultra-processed foods could be perfectly healthy. But the research kept piling up. Study after study linked ultra-processed foods to chronic disease, not just in Brazil, but everywhere. France, the UK, Canada, Mexico, the United States. In America, Nearly 60% of calories consumed come from ultra-processed foods. In children, it's closer to 70%. The modern diet had become a chemistry experiment, and people were the test subjects. Here's what makes ultra-processed foods so dangerous. It's not just what they contain, it's what they replace. When you fill up on these industrial formulations, you're not eating real food. You're not getting fiber from vegetables. You're not getting nutrients from whole grains. You're not getting the natural fats and proteins your body needs. Instead, you're getting engineered products designed to override your natural satiety signals, making you eat more than you should. Because that's the secret the industry doesn't want you to know. These foods are intentionally designed to be addictive. Food scientists study the bliss point, the perfect combination of sugar, fat, and salt that makes your brain light up like a Christmas tree. They engineer textures that dissolve quickly in your mouth so you don't feel full. They add flavor enhancers that make cheap ingredients taste like real food. They use colors that trigger cravings. Every aspect of these products is calculated to make you buy more, eat more, and never feel satisfied. The man who really brought this into public consciousness wasn't a scientist. It was a journalist named Michael Pollan. In 2006, his book The Omnivore's Dilemma exposed how the industrial food system really works. He followed the food chain from farm to table and showed how corn and soybeans had become the foundation of nearly everything Americans eat. Not as recognizable vegetables, but as broken-down chemical components reassembled into products bearing little resemblance to actual food. He called them edible food-like substances. Pollan's work resonated because it was simple. He distilled everything into 7 words. Eat food, not too much. Mostly plants. And when he said eat food, he meant real food. Food your grandmother would recognize. Not the 47,000 products lining supermarket shelves, most of which hadn't existed 50 years earlier. His advice was revolutionary in its simplicity. Shop the perimeter of the store where the fresh foods are kept. Avoid anything with more than 5 ingredients. If you can't pronounce it, don't eat it. But simplicity doesn't always mean easy, because ultra-processed foods are everywhere. They're cheap. They're convenient. They're heavily marketed. And for many people, especially those in food deserts or working multiple jobs, they're the only realistic option. That's not an accident. It's by design. The food system was deliberately structured to make healthy eating expensive and difficult, while making junk food cheap and accessible. And here's where it gets really insidious. As public awareness of ultra-processed foods grew, the industry adapted. They started reformulating products, adding whole grain to sugary cereals and slapping healthy on the box, creating plant-based versions of processed foods and marketing them as natural, removing specific additives that had been criticized while adding different ones. They even started funding their own research, studies designed to muddy the waters and create doubt about whether processing really matters. Some researchers fell for it. They argued that not all ultra-processed foods are equally bad. That whole grain bread, even if technically ultra-processed, is better than white bread. That plant-based yogurt with added sugar is still healthier than ice cream. They said the NOVA classification was too blunt an instrument, that it stigmatized foods that could be part of a healthy diet. But this misses the point entirely. The issue isn't whether one ultra-processed food is slightly less terrible than another. It's that these foods have taken over the entire food system. Because when Montero and other researchers looked at actual health outcomes, the pattern was clear. People who ate more ultra-processed foods got sicker. It didn't matter if it was soda or whole grain crackers. The processing itself was the problem. These foods are stripped of fiber, loaded with additives, engineered for overconsumption, and designed to replace real food in the diet. They disrupt the gut microbiome. They cause inflammation. They interfere with hormones that regulate appetite. They're literally changing how our bodies work. And the scary part is how fast this happened. In just 2 generations, the American food environment was completely transformed. In the late 1960s, supermarkets carried maybe 800 products. By 2018, that number had exploded to over 40,000. More than half are discretionary foods with little nutritional value. 6 out of 10 are highly processed. Nearly all convenience foods, ready-to-eat meals, prepared sauces, frozen dinners, are ultra-processed. The entire infrastructure of eating had been rebuilt around industrial formulations. This is what the food industry doesn't want you to understand. They've spent decades and billions of dollars normalizing these products, making them seem like food, marketing them to children, placing them at eye level on shelves, running ads during family television, sponsoring nutritionists who'll defend them, funding research that questions any criticism, fighting regulation at every turn, all to protect a system that makes them rich while making you sick. The evidence is overwhelming now. In 2024, a massive analysis published in the British Medical Journal reviewed 32 studies linking ultra-processed foods to negative health outcomes. Higher rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, even depression. The World Health Organization has started comparing these products to alcohol and tobacco in terms of their damage to public health. Countries like France and Brazil have incorporated warnings about ultra-processed foods into their dietary guidelines. Some places are even banning certain products from school lunches. But in America, the industry still holds immense power. They lobby against any meaningful regulation. They fight labeling requirements that might help consumers identify ultra-processed foods. They fund think tanks that produce industry-friendly research. They've built a system where the most profitable foods are also the most harmful, and then they've made it nearly impossible to escape that system. Here's the thing, though. You have more power than they want you to believe. Every time you choose real food over a processed product, you're voting with your dollars. Every time you cook a meal instead of heating up a frozen dinner, you're taking back control. Every time you read an ingredient list and decide you do and want to eat polysorbate 80 or sodium stearoyl lactylate, you're refusing to participate in their chemistry experiment, because that's what this really is, an experiment. These foods, most of them anyway, haven't been around long enough for anyone to know their long-term effects. Sure, each individual additive has been tested and declared safe within certain limits. But nobody knows what happens when you eat dozens of them together, 3 times a day, for your entire life. Nobody knows how they interact with each other, how they accumulate in your body, what they do to your children's development. We're finding out in real time, and the results aren't encouraging. The secret origin of ultra-processed foods isn't really a secret anymore. It's a story of wartime innovation turned peacetime profit, of farm subsidies creating ingredient surpluses, of food scientists breaking down crops into chemical components, of corporations engineering products for addiction rather than nutrition, of researchers sounding alarms and being silenced, of an industry that cares more about margins than health, of a food system designed to make you sick so another industry can profit from treating your diseases. Montero and Pollan and all those dismissed voices from the 80s were right. The degree of processing matters. What happens to food before it reaches your plate shapes what happens in your body after you eat it. Real food rots. It has a short shelf life because it's alive. Ultra-processed products last forever because they're not really food anymore. They're industrial formulations optimized for profit. So what do you do with this information? Start simple. Follow Pollan's advice. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Shop the perimeter of the grocery store where the real food lives. Learn to cook, even if it's just a few basic meals. Read ingredient lists and ask yourself if you'd use those ingredients in your own kitchen. If the answer is no, maybe don't eat it. Buy from farmers markets when you can. Support companies that make actual food rather than food products. This isn't about perfection. Nobody's saying you can never have a cookie or a soda. It's about understanding what you're actually eating and making informed choices. It's about recognizing that the food industry has spent decades manipulating you and deciding you're done being manipulated. It's about teaching your kids that food comes from the earth, not from a factory. It's about rebuilding a relationship with real food, one meal at a time. The term ultra-processed might be relatively new to most people, but the problem it describes has been building for decades. Now you know the origin story. Now you know what they didn't want you to know. The question is, what are you going to do about it? If this video changed how you think about food, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're digging into the hidden history of the food and health industries, uncovering the secrets they don't want you to know. Your support helps us keep making these videos and spreading the truth. And drop a comment. What's the most shocking thing you learned? Have you started reading ingredient lists differently? Let's keep this conversation going. Because the more people who understand what ultra-processed really means, the harder it becomes for the industry to keep selling us chemistry experiments disguised as food. Knowledge is power. Use it.